Muchas gracias. Good morning, warm welcome. You thought maybe at the title, oh, holy cow, Sunday morning, and such a really maybe quite demanding, tough kind of title. There it is. And maybe if you want to think of a subtitle, I would call it Getting Back to Basics. And I would like to start with a quote. Those of you who actually joined the writing workshop yesterday, maybe you remember that quote because I find it quite fitting. And that is, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And this is from Maya Angelou, as maybe some of you may know. I would like to start off with some, in a way, assumptions which have driven much of my work on trauma-informed approaches to polarization and peace building, but also one particular type of work which I had the great honor to steer and to initiate with dear Claudia, sitting over there. And these are two important starting points. First of all, we human beings, we are hardwired for connection. We are hardwired for connection, meaning we need others to validate, to acknowledge, to witness our experiences, no matter if they're traumatic or not. So we really need others. We need to be connected to ourselves, of course, but we also need to be connected to others. What is happening in polarization is actually the opposite. We see disconnection. We see fragmentation. And when we think of our own communities, we spoke a little bit about Germany and Spain earlier, but when we think of all the communities, all the societies you're coming from, I'm sure you agree, and I'm not saying anything controversial, that in all the societies, you, we are coming from, we see different levels of, for instance, unprocessed trauma. We see a lot of physical, emotional abuse, we see a lot of discrimination, and we see a lot of political exclusion. And the people who are affected by that pay a heavy price. Very often it comes in the form of toxic stress, it comes in the form of trauma. And I think we have to understand much better how trauma informs polarization, but also how polarization, again, gives way to different forms of individual and collective trauma. I just want to give you one simple example. What happens if people feel their grievances are not heard? One way of coping with that is that people further withdraw. They might even opt for self-exclusion because they realize my grievances do not matter. Nobody is paying attention to them. My grievances are maybe even criminalized or weaponized for other purposes. So people withdraw, and then what we actually see is that, of course, we have forms of social isolation, loneliness, and as you may know, in all European countries, we see a dramatic increase in loneliness. And we also know from the current research on trauma that loneliness, very often, especially young people, can lead to radicalization, can lead to young people thinking, oh, authoritarianism, why not? It's not maybe such a bad kind of government system after all. So what does it all mean? It means, of course, to put trauma center stage, in my humble understanding, if we want to understand polarization. But given that I said it's also about getting back to basics, for me it's also about reviving the skill we talk so much about in peace building, namely deep listening. For me, deep listening should become an act of resistance. An act of resistance to say, I take the time to deeply listen. So I listen with the intention to deeply understand what somebody's saying, not to reply as we often do, but really take the time to say, oh, that's kind of interesting, that totally confuses me, but let me listen to your story. What is your story? And I strongly believe in the work Claudia and I have been doing, that deep listening is not only an act of resistance, but it can be an act of social repair, and it can become a very powerful act of connection to oneself and to others. But two important conditions have to be in place for that. The first one is safety, and we talk so much about safety. Huh? We love talking about in peace building. We love to create safe spaces. Now, what we know is if participants in any kind of process we are conducting, if people do not feel safe, they will not fully, authentically engage, and they will not be able to listen. And if people feel their identities and their positions, their needs are questioned, are challenged, are under fire, then people's flight, fight, and freeze responses take over. Logic, reasoning, and empathy will actually shut down. So that begs the question, how can we then create these safe spaces? And I'm maybe following a slightly unorthodox approach. I would say a space is then safe when people can turn up in their messiness, in their vulnerability, in their beauty, in their glory, and they learn how to regulate themselves and others. And yesterday, those of you who also had the great honor to be in the writing resistance workshop, I would say for me this was a safe space because I saw all of that. And then the question is, okay, what are simple techniques? Maybe we all don't want to become psychotherapists or take a training in trauma healing. I think, for instance, to learn how to breathe. How often, and I just had to think of that myself this morning, how often do we forget to really deeply breathe in and breathe out? Okay, and these are simple techniques we can learn. There are, for instance, different tapping techniques, which Claudia and I have been practiced throughout the work we have been doing. But there are also other techniques which allow us more to be connected to our bodies. And we also saw that last night, namely dancing. I dance a lot with women, and sometimes also with men, if they want to, in workshops. And then out of sudden you see a different kind of energy. You feel, people getting connected to their bodies. Then I think, Amelie, you reminded us of the power of humor. I think humor is an untapped resource in peace building. You cannot be angry and smile at the same time. That is physiologically not possible. Try to be angry and smile at the same time. Not possible at all. So I think we have to learn how to use humor. I was once in northern India and I asked the women, feminist women, of course, and I asked them, so how do you want us to create safety? And they said, Cordula, we want us to talk about jokes. We want to crack jokes about patriarchy, about our culture, and the men who are suppressing us. And they're cracking jokes, and this is our way of creating safety. Then in another context, people said, okay, Cordula, thanks, we have done now the breathing. Let's talk about our fear. They say we create safety through talking about our fear. So they said, let's create fear spaces where we actually tap into our fear and never dare to talk about. So safety is an important condition. And of course, all of these different techniques I was just referring to, they have one thing in common, namely they connect ourselves to our bodies and to others. Now, I want to give two examples which for me speak to the power of storytelling, the power of human stories. During COVID, a colleague and friend of mine, we were observing that some of our friends, the husband was vaccinated, the wife wasn't vaccinated, and they couldn't have sex any longer. And they were saying, what can we do? And then we could also see in our circle of friends, we had similar dimensions. People stopped talking to each other. And then I saw what is going on in Switzerland, you know. As we know, the basic democracy, everyone can participate. What's going on in this society? People trying to ignore others, trying to sideline others, calling people. And then we initiated some kind of online process where we basically said to people, come as you are. And we had very simple technique, which was, if you think of the vaccination, I feel, bam, bam, bam. And then we asked people just to finish the sentence. And we had 7 minutes in each kind of tandem or trio. And it was all about storytelling. And of course, the people didn't change their opinion about, for instance, vaccination, if they were against vaccination. But what happened was that people showed greater empathy. They said, I still don't share his or her or their opinion, but I can now see where they're coming from. And that was a little bit exactly the same spirit Claudia and I took when we initiated last year a process which we called Zwischentöne in German and in English nuances, where we actually try to say in polarization we talk so much about the loudest in the room. And we wanted to change that completely by actually putting the focus on people which are hardly heard in most societies. People with disabilities, refugees, people who don't have any formal papers in Switzerland, so the sans-papiers, and the youth, and people living in Switzerland below the poverty line. And we collected 70 stories. People told their stories. And a lot of donors said to us, you know, how can you make sure that there aren't any kind of conspiracy theories? Isn't there a danger? You let everyone talk. And I'm not sure, Claudia, if you agree. I think what we saw were stories of survival, strong stories of survival, of resilience, strong stories of the human ability to overcome all different kinds of challenges. And I'm sharing that example which Claudia and I initiated to show that I believe the future is in the politics of listening. I think if our focus in our own kind of decision-making was more driven by this deep understanding of listening, I think our societies would be looking very different. Thank you.
Thank you so much.